going to come to questions in a second, because I think there's lots to talk about with this, and I'm sure people want to ask questions. But I'm intrigued, first of all, Gary and Julian. So, you set up your prize, you win your prize, it all gets announced and so on. What's happened since? Who have you spoken to? Have politicians come up to you and said, oh, that's quite interesting? What's been the reaction?
Shall I go first and see if Gary says the same thing as me? It might be different. My sense is that there's huge interest privately. So lots of bits of government, lots of the system, some politicians, all think the current system doesn't work very well. They actually do want a better road system. They're afraid of just throwing money at it that they don't have, although I think if persuaded by people who run roads that there was a good investment program, they could increase the amount of money. They want to think about long-term finance. The officials are much more interested in it than the politicians, because politicians will be out of a job possibly by tonight. The officials will hopefully not be out of a job by tonight and will be there for several years. And so they're worried about the finance. Treasury officials certainly are. And I think the things that have surprised me from the start on doing the prize are how little the car industry is interested. There's a huge divide, I sense, between the people who build and run the roads and the people who build and sell cars. That, to me, is completely insane. And in the next few years, as technology changes, and cars depend much more on the technology of the road to manage their driving, and roads need to adapt to support autonomous vehicles, those two things are going to have to come together, but at the moment they just haven't. So the car industry is still denying there's a problem. The Treasury is fascinated by the problem, and politicians are wondering quite what's happening on Twitter right now.
It's really interesting that the car industry hasn't engaged at all with it, actually.
I mean, that may be slightly unfair, but I sense the car industry talks a lot about mobility solutions and changing its nature from the bottom up, and most car industry people are still interested in leather interiors and whether the air conditioning's good and whether they can make money out of the finance package. I think the car industry is heading for a massive crash on finance, and I think the public have no interest in leather interiors anymore. So my advice to them is get with the program and start thinking about finance and selling a product, which is more than just a vehicle.
Gary, what has life been like since you won?
What's happened? A couple of things. Firstly, we bought a house, so that's really good. But no, on a serious note, we've begun talks with both the Treasury and like you were saying, it is really the officials, because they are there for the long term so far, who have expressed a lot of interest. Apart from that, you might be surprised to hear, but insurers are also, there's two insurers we've spoken with, and they think it's a good idea. They think this could solve the thing, and they, because again, they have an existing system, they don't mind. They're happy to use it. So
I'm interested in how the insurance thing works. So would they basically be paid or get more money because they're administering this system? I'm assuming they'd love that.
Yeah, we included like a handling fee, a very, very small proportion, which we calculated to equate roughly the collection costs of fuel duty. But really, it could work without a fee, because the insurance market is regulated by the government, so the government would have to mandate insurers to do this anyway. It can work either way, but I think insurers are purely interested because this is, they appreciate the problem that motorists face regarding congestion and all that, and I think they also want to fix it, and they want to be in for the fix. So.
I think they're foreseeing a bit of a loss of income as well, potentially, with automated cars and a cut in accidents, aren't they?
Potentially,
yes.
How
their business model goes into the future.
This would give them one guaranteed role, which is revenue collection, I suspect.
I mean, we know Julian's been behind the scenes, so have you, Steve, and from the outside, it looks impossible. It looks like no one is ever really going to be able to be the politician that feels secure enough to stand up and say, we're going to change all of this, and then take all the flack that comes their way.
Well, I think that the thing to think about is whether we're offering the politicians the opportunity to stand up, be brave, and say, I have decided we're going to do something different. It's my idea, and I'm going to implement it, and you will vote me back in the next Parliament because you're so happy with my idea. I think it's quite interesting to look at the draft transport strategy for London that Sadiq Khan has published, which is very, very cautious and vague about what he might do with the London congestion charge. And you might think Sadiq was in a position to be rather more dramatic and bold. I mean, he has been on equality and he has been on some other things. But I think what I think I see there is a sense that he would rather others said to him, we now think you need to act. And you said you're willing to think about changing the congestion charge. Well, you better get on and do it. So I think the politicians will need to feel a greater sense that we, perhaps road users, are saying, come on, you've got to do something, rather than being out in front leading that debate as they sought to do back in 2004, 5, 6.
Doug, you brought in London as well. Is the sense then that it hasn't been sold very well in London, the idea, or it just hasn't worked very well?
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, the congestion charge in London hasn't exactly been used to pay for improved roads or increasing road space. And the traffic moves roughly at the same speed as it did before the charge was implemented. So they managed to reduce usage and still not not reduce congestion. And it ought to be quite hard to do that. It takes a special kind of genius to manage that dynamic double. And only Ken Livingstone, I think, was quite capable of it. So, yes, they haven't done well, and that's one of the reasons road users are suspicious, which is why I like Gary's idea of having a ring fencing. I've proposed it in a slightly different way, but we're both saying much the same thing, which is that you need to make sure that money going into the system stays in the system and doesn't get nicked. They call it technically club effects, the effect of these things. And the sort of image you have is a club secretary with his hand in the till. And I think it's important that we try and remove that image so that we get a more successful system.
Presumably, though, that gives chancellors another issue. Julia, am I right in thinking, or you, Steve, you probably know this as well, about a third of the money raised from road tax actually goes on cars?
Yeah.
Is that about right? On drivers, on roads, and so on?
I mean, Steve will have the exact figures. You could debate exactly the level depending on things like VAT on garage bills and the wider kind of car industry and how you look at freight. But yes, so it's about 9-10 billion maximum on roads
then
and
that's
30 billion of revenue.
That's a lot of money you'd then be spending additionally on roads that you wouldn't be spending on hospitals and teachers.
Even if you prevented the decline in revenue, you would start getting additional money for roads. The problem is the gap between what comes in and what's needing to go out is growing. So it is, Gary says, 2.3 million a day. If you stopped the fall, you wouldn't need to put charges up. You would still end up with more money, which could go into roads.
Gary, what do you think is the thing people have remembered about your pitch? Is it that pothole-free Britain thing, which is it's really the thing I've seen in a lot of headlines? That seems to be the thing that's grabbed people more than everyone else. Anything else?
Yeah, that's right. I think that's clearly what people want. I included a study, don't remember who it was done by, but the number one item of concern for road users is the quality of the road surface. I'm half Italian, half Hungarian, and the roads in Italy are wonderful. As a cyclist, it's great to ride on, really smooth. Whereas sometimes here, just the surface, the quality, the cracks, bigger, and it may be damaging to a car, but it's actually very, very, can be fatal for a cyclist if the pothole is big enough. So I think that's where we should start on, and that links into how the money is then spent, which I think none of the Wolfson Prize entrants answered as much as Julian would have liked. Yeah. But we think that maintenance has to be very much on the agenda because connected vehicles and better utilized vehicles might possibly, we don't really know, but improve congestion. So adding capacity might be a short-term thing until we find out what will happen in the future. What we really need to focus on is to make sure that the existing roads are of very good quality.
Presumably it's quite a quick way to do something people will notice as well, filling in potholes.
Yes,
indeed.
indeed.
If anyone would like to ask a question, put your hand up and we can get a microphone to you. There's always quite a few. So we'll start with this gentleman here, and then we'll go to the back afterwards. So we can rush a mic over to you.
Thanks very much. My name's John Mason. I actually used to be the director of congestion charging in London between 2001 and 2009. So, putting aside the criticisms that Doug raised, I kind of come towards where Steve is, which is I have some real doubts that road pricing will ever materialise in the way that it's perhaps envisaged. But my kind of big bugbear is enforcement and how schemes are enforced, like the one that Gary mentioned, like a black box future solution, and how these are enforced. Because our experiences is that there's quite a high percentage of people that use our roads that aren't actually very good law-abiding citizens and do absolutely everything that they can to avoid either a congestion charge scheme in London, a scheme as proposed by Gary. So I just wondered what the panel's view was on how do you enforce a simple, straightforward scheme, ensuring that the declared mileage is correct. How do you enforce black box type schemes? And with Brexit in mind, how do you finally tackle that massive issue about foreign registered vehicles and how vehicles from the continent pay to use our roads? So a few points.
Really good points. Who wants to have a go?
Yeah, thank you. I think that's really going to the heart of the matter, because fuel duty, the two things what fuel duty does really well, it's very cheap to actually collect all the revenues, because you just go to the producers of fuel. And that's the thing that Miles Better does really well. It has very low cost implementation. And the second thing that fuel duty is really good at is everyone has to pay. And that is more difficult. But the way we've gone around it is, at the moment, it's estimated about 3% of people 3% of vehicles are not insured. And I think that's actually a very strong reason why insurers would be keen on bringing that figure down. What I spotted is that there is a difference between the vehicles that are uninsured, they're 3% estimate, and the vehicles that don't currently pay a vehicle excise duty, which is, I think, 0.5% of all vehicles. So if that enforcement can be brought down, then it's better for all those, all the people who are victims, for example, of uninsured drivers and so on, and so it's about active enforcement and policing and finding the funds for that enforcement, in my view. And that has to come from a previously uncaptured source of money. Don't know if that answers.
I think, sorry, if I can just back up what Gary's saying there. I think that it is a fact that fuel duty is the most cost-efficient tax of anywhere in the world. And anything that replaces it is going to have a higher cost of collection, and that's just an inconvenient truth, and we're going to have to suck it up. Second, though, I think that we have a rising problem of uninsured driving. So after the competition had closed, the figures have started to come out of the fact that uninsured driving is on the up. But the good news is it is a detectable offence, and it's detectable relatively simply because the automatic number plate recognition system the police and others use very widely is capable and is linked to the Motor Insurance Bureau. You could be detected and that could be pursued, and I think Gary's absolutely right. We would have to have a more vigorous enforcement system, much as was the case, particularly in the early days of the congestion charge, where it was very tightly enforced. Because unless that happens, people are very quickly going to decide this isn't fair. Just like people get very exercised about benefit cheats and people cheating on their income tax, we sort of don't mind paying income tax so long as everybody else is paying it. But by golly, we really don't like paying it and discovering other people, I don't know, are touching down with their private jets in Ireland in order to escape it.
Doug, you've looked at crunching the numbers. How big an issue is enforcement, or do you think technology will just really help crack down on that relatively cheaply?
Well, I think, as the questioner will be even more aware of than I am, enforcement is a serious issue, even with technology. But of course, it does give you opportunities, because you can raise quite a lot of money from fines from people who are non-compliant. And actually, the current congestion charging system works quite well on that basis. We will have to spend, I would think, My estimate was between 5 and 10% of the money on enforcement to make sure it works. Because I would prefer a system that involves some sensitivity to the state of the road and the degree of congestion and so on, although clearly you'd need pre-notification, because otherwise you can't make a decision on usage. You don't want to be told suddenly that you're paying a high charge once you're in the traffic jam, because frankly there's nothing you can do once you're in the traffic jam. So it has to be more like the surge charging that Uber asked you about. Are you prepared to pay it before you start on the journey? But because I would prefer something like that, I think it has to be built into the technology of the vehicle through a black box or something like that. And obviously that does A, add to the cost, and B, it creates a slightly different enforcement issue. But I think if you want actually to have something, a congestion charging that varies with congestion, you are going to have to bite, or you have to grasp that nettle, unfortunately. And I think you do have to allow for the fact that it will cost a bit. But on the other hand, the cost of motoring, once we get to different forms of propulsion and different forms of technology, the cost is set to fall fairly dramatically. So there is some scope in this. So I don't think we should be too pessimistic.
There was a question at the back.
Jonathan Mosley from Ernst & Young. My question was partly touched on by the previous questioner, but some years ago, government started to explore introduction of a lorry road user charge. And my question to the panel is, do they feel that lorry road user charging might be a stepping stone to the introduction of full road pricing at some stage in the future, possibly as a politically slightly less contentious means of conditioning expectation, or actually is that a dead end and irrelevant, perhaps as a result of technological advances?
Shall I pick that up first? I think the answer is yes, if it can give something back to freight users. If it's just a form of tax which doesn't solve congestion for freight vehicles, in the end, the higher the tax, the more the squeals from the industry, and at some point you'll reach a limit. But linked to some benefit, the answer could be yes. The trouble is if you only start to do charging on one kind of vehicle and attempt to manage possibly congestion on one kind of vehicle, you don't really solve the bigger problem. I know in government there was a lot of pleasure at the success of the initial sort of voucher scheme, the carnet scheme for lorries, and it raised a lot more money than was expected, although in the scheme of things it wasn't that much.
I'll say a few words, but in all honesty, the freight system is quite complicated, and I didn't spend as much time on it as probably I will do in the future. So one of the other things that I'm doing as a follow-up is actually getting to know how that system works and how that particular system, which has unique challenges, can be improved as part of a bigger change. But I don't think I can comment on that question just yet. I'm not there yet. But actually, I did want to say something before, because one of the things that I wanted to tackle with the enforcement with Miles Better was to give a real incentive for people to pay the charge. And that's why the bundling with insurance seemed like such a good idea, because most of us would quite possibly buy insurance whether it was compulsory or not. It's because we want the protection in the future unforeseen scenario. So because we want that, and we want that insurance to be valid, and insurance isn't valid if we haven't paid tax, if we haven't, there's a series of criteria. So, or if the details we gave were wrong and incorrect. So we want the insurance to be valid, and one of the criteria is road tax payment. So when the payment is also bundled, then we'll have an interest in making sure that all of that is in order. So I think it's that slightly subtle kind of behavioral argument of how to make sure that people, we have to do less enforcement and people will just want to pay it because it makes sense. And if they think it's fair, then I would think that most of us will pay it, yeah.
Coming back to the question about the lorry charge, I can say that the answer to your question, I think, is an emphatic yes. It is definitely something that we would learn from. Having been party to the original, the early 2000s lorry road user charge, I would say one of the reasons it imploded was it had become too clever for its own good. It was too complicated, and it was a very expensive, or going to be a very expensive system to implement. The HGV levy that was introduced a couple of years ago was, in many ways, learning from the previous example. Start off with something simple. Start off with something that is not techy, not clever, doesn't link to congestion, but just gets the haulage sector used to the fact that they're going to be paying this amount in a different way. I don't doubt that the next iteration of that will be a more sophisticated approach, and by testing that more sophisticated approach on 500,000 vehicles instead of 34 million vehicles strikes me as a sensible stepping stone for trialling something in a different way.
Well, guys, we're going to leave it there. We're going to have a seamless changeover now of people on, so people won't even notice. But thank you very much. Really stimulating. We'll see if we're still talking about it in 2026 when we fall off an economic cliff. Please